We've always seen the rich as mega figures who we would like to become one day. I mean, when I was 5, I wanted to be a billionaire with a mansion and a little poodle with a pink collar. I mean, who doesn't? However, their flashy lifestyles are only flashy in theory. These wealth seekers and their impact on consumerism just might be fueling climate change. Today, we're diving into the world of the mega rich and their impact on climate change. Welcome to Sustainable Sense, where we invest in climate defense. You're in for our hot take on all things money, markets, and the environment. In 2018, Professor Stephen Gosling and his team embarked on a fascinating mission. They delved into the social media profiles of some of the wealthiest celebrities, stalking at its finest, from Paris Hilton to Oprah Winfrey, in search of evidence of their extravagant jet-setting lifestyles. And what they found was staggering. Take Bill Gates, for example. Known as the world's most high-profile environmental activist, he took a whopping 59 flights in 2017 alone. That's enough to circumnavigate the globe more than 8 times. These flights generated over 1,600 tons of greenhouse gases, equivalent to the average yearly emissions of 105 Americans. Many of the world's wealthiest individuals are also major stakeholders in large corporations, particularly in industries such as energy, transportation, and manufacturing. These corporations can have a significant impact on climate change through their emissions, lobbying efforts, and investment choices. Talk about a Yeti-sized carbon footprint. However, it's important to note that the rich may also be able to help. But we do have only a few of these activists in the grand scheme of things. Some wealthy investors are involved in impact investing, directing their capital toward business and projects with environmentally sustainable goals, and other things like divestment. This can help promote climate-friendly innovations and technologies. Wealthy individuals may choose to offset their carbon emissions by investing in projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, such as reforestation or renewable energy initiatives. While this can be beneficial, it should not be seen as a substitute for reducing emissions at the source. Wealthy individuals often have a platform and resources to raise awareness about climate change and advocate for climate action. They can use their influence to mobilize public opinion and push for policy changes. Now, Gosling's research aimed to shed light on the consumption levels of the mega-rich, whose lifestyles often remain shrouded in secrecy. And coincidentally, the research coincided with the rise of the environmental movement spearheaded by the inspiring Greta Thunberg. Suddenly, flying became a symbol of personal accountability for the carbon conscious. Greta herself once wrote, "The bigger your carbon footprint, the bigger your moral duty." And it's true. Over the last few decades, we've witnessed a growing spotlight on global inequality. The 2008 financial crisis, the pandemic, and the increasingly severe impacts of climate change have hit the poorest the hardest. But here's the catch. When we talk about tackling inequality, we often overlook overconsumption. Louis Akenji, the managing director of the Hot and Cold Institute, a Berlin-based think tank, puts it perfectly. Each unit you overshoot means someone has to give something up. The outsized carbon footprints of the richest individuals entrench inequality and threaten our ability to combat climate change. Their disproportionate impacts leave the rest of us staggering behind. So, who exactly are these mega rich individuals we're talking about? Take a guess on their incomes. 1 million? 1 billion? 1 trillion even? Well, it may surprise you to learn that the income of just $38,000 can put someone in the world's richest 10%, while $109,000 catapults them to the top 1%. That's according to the data from Oxfam and the Stockholm Environment Institute. But here's where it gets even more startling. The world's wealthiest 10% were responsible for around half of global emissions in 2015, while the top 1% alone accounted for 15% of emissions. Meanwhile, the world's poorest 50% were responsible for just 7% of emissions. It's an alarming disparity, especially considering that those who emit the least are the ones who bear the brunt of the climate impacts. From what I've learned, those who lack the most resources are usually the most creative with their solutions. Our capitalistic, sedentary society has influenced carbon impact. As we race against the clock to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius warning limit, the rich are devouring the remaining carbon budget. This is the amount of greenhouse gases we can emit without pushing our planet beyond the point of no return. As they continue on their high carbon lifestyles, they leave little room for the bottom 50% to meet their basic needs without further exacerbating the climate crisis. Dario Kenner, the author of Carbon Inequality, The Role of the Richest in Climate Change, coined the term polluter elite to describe the wealthiest individuals who not only invest heavily in fossil fuels, but also lead high carbon lifestyles. That's a big no. However, it's important to note that the world's wealthiest encompass a broad range of people, not just the polluter elite. For all you know, you may be included in the people with a high carbon footprint. Now let's zoom in on personal consumption. Most people in wealthy countries are consuming in ways that accelerate the climate catastrophe. In the UK, for example, the average person emits a staggering 8.5 tons of carbon each year. And in Canada, that number rises to a whopping 14.2 tons, making it the country with the highest emissions among those surveyed by the Hot or Cool Institute. Notice a pattern here. These are both developed countries with a high amount of wealthy individuals. But hold on a sec. To stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, those figures need to plummet to zero point 0.7 tons per person by 2050. That's quite the drop. When it comes to a high carbon footprint, there's another thing we gotta consider: hyper-consumerism. Bet you weren't expecting that. Hyperconsumerism is closely related to late stage capitalism and refers to an excessive and unsustainable focus on consumerism. It's not just the rich who do this, but also generally lazy individuals who could be characterized as creatures of habit in my dictionary. It's described as a societal condition where individuals are encouraged and driven to consume beyond their basic needs. Hyperconsumerism is characterized by materialistic culture, where there's a strong emphasis on acquiring material possessions as a measure of success and happiness, and planned obsolescence. Products are intentionally designed to have short lifespans, encouraging frequent replacement and continuous consumption. Along with this, throwaway culture has gained traction in recent decades. Disposable and single use items have become prevalent, leading to excessive waste generation and environmental degradation. Remember the short lived Barbie trend? Well, we had so many people buying new pink outfits and throwing them the next day, worsening the pollution and promoting the throwaway culture. And lastly, credit and debt. Easy access to credit and the normalization of debt contribute to increased consumption and consumer dependency. If we normalize debt and promote spending, we are feeding the hyperconsumption cycle. Are you falling for hyperconsumerism without realizing it? Let's play a game of Wheel of Hyperconsumerism. Except there's no wheel or celebrity hosts, unless you count me, that is. So let's see where you fall on the consumerist bandwagon. Do you have excessive accumulation of possessions, impulsive and unplanned purchases, constant pursuit of the latest trends, over-reliance on credit and debt, emotional dependency on shopping, or disregard for the environmental impact? I'll give you a few more moments to tally your scores. If you do 4 to 6 of these things, you're definitely practicing unsustainable spending habits. If you do 2 to 3, you're okay, but could be a bit better with your ethical spending habits. If you do none to 2 of these things, then you're on the right track to a sustainable lifestyle. If you're constantly feeling the need to acquire more and more material possessions, even when you already have an abundance of similar items, it may be a sign of hyperconsumerism. Making impulsive buying decisions often leads to accumulating items that are rarely used or quickly discarded, just like the Barbie trend. If you always feel the pressure to own the latest fashion, gadgets, or other trendy products, regardless of whether you genuinely need or value them, it may indicate a tendency towards hyperconsumerism as well. On top of that, using credit cards or loans excessively to finance your purchases and consistently carrying high levels of consumer debt can be a warning sign of hyperconsumerism and can contribute to financial stress. And if you use shopping as a means to cope with stress, boredom, or emotional challenges, I'm sorry to say you're practicing hyperconsumerism. But finally, hyperconsumerism often involves a lack of consideration for the environmental consequences of our consumption habits. If you regularly discard items without considering recycle or proper disposal methods, or show little concern for the environmental impact of your purchases, it may suggest hyperconsumerist tendencies. As a Gen Zer who loves buying stuff from Amazon and Target and browsing the shelves, I totally get it. But it's time to put the world's needs above your own. Sometimes it pays to take a step back and look at the real implications behind your everyday decisions. Critics of late-stage capitalism and hyper-consumerism argue that these trends prioritize profit over social and environmental well-being. They raise concerns about the negative consequences, including environmental degradation, social inequality, overproduction, and exploitation of resources and labor. Now, you might be wondering, is individual action the solution? Well, it's a complex question. While it's true that personal choices matter, tackling climate change requires a combination of individual actions and systematic changes from governments and corporations. It's not a simple either or scenario. Louis Akenji from the Hot or Cool Institute puts it this way: lifestyles don't exist in a vacuum, they're shaped by context. So, in other words, we live our lives within political and economic systems that often promote unsustainably. But if we don't address the consumption patterns of the wealthy and powerful and the lazy, we won't be able to truly tackle climate change. So, how do we bring about change exactly? One approach is through targeted taxes on unsustainable behaviors like frequent flying and overconsumption of meat and incentivizing more sustainable options. By linking these taxes to investment that benefits society as a whole, we can nudge people towards low carbon choices. Another intriguing idea is a personal carbon allowance, or PCA, where individuals are allocated tradable carbon allowances. If someone wants to emit more, they must purchase allowances from others. Since money is a very incentivizing tool, it can be used to greatly persuade audiences. This concept has been explored in various countries, but its implementation comes with challenges like cost and social acceptance. It might be a little hard to introduce a concept as drastic as this, but little changes can go a long way. To address hyper-consumerism, we need a collective approach. As they say, we're better together. Here's our climate conscious to-do list. So first, promote conscious consumerism by making informed choices and supporting sustainable brands. Then educate individuals about environmental and social impacts of consumption and challenge societal norms that equate happiness with material possessions. After that, encourage businesses to adopt sustainable practices and responsible production. Additionally, regulate advertising and marketing practices that exploit consumer vulnerabilities. We should shift our focus from GDP to well-being and alternative metrics. Finally, we can foster collaboration among governments, businesses, and communities to develop innovative solutions. I understand that it may be a bit hard to raise your voice and demand change to a more conscious, holistic economy, but by combining these efforts, we can move toward a more sustainable and fulfilling future. Now, we've covered a lot today, but the bottom line is this: the mega rich and their consumption habits set the tone for society. They have the power to influence societal norms and shape the choices available to everyone. If we want a sustainable future, we must hold governments and the wealthy accountable for their actions and demand bold climate action. We must also be aware of our spending habits and avoid falling for the hyper-consumerist trap. Next time there's a big trend going on, think twice about you and your impact before hopping on. Well, that wraps up today's eye-opening episode of Sustainable Sense. Remember, individual actions matter, but real change requires collective efforts and systematic transformations. Join us next time as we continue to explore the fascinating world of climate solutions. Do we adapt or address climate change? And don't forget, make sure to follow us on Instagram at Sustainable Sense Podcast. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at sustainablesensepodcast@gmail.com or on LinkedIn. And as always, invest your sense in climate defense.